right, welcome to the Wednesday edition of Unexpected Points. I have another special guest here. I have Michael Lopez. Michael is the Director of Football Data and Analytics for the NFL. I don't know how many things I want to list off here. You got a big resume here. PhD from Brown, Masters in Statistics from UMass Amherst, and also, folks, he played the game. Offensive line for 4 years while a math major. Pretty much checking all boxes, so no nerd or football guy can come at you. So I appreciate having that level of quality of guest on the show. Thanks, Mike, for joining me.
Kevin, thanks for having me. You've had quite a cadre of guests here recently, so I'm happy to join you in the off season. It's a fun time and excited. I'll also add to our list that I'm wearing a light blue shirt like you are, so the stars are aligning. It should be a fun little chat.
Yeah, perfect guess. You even can intuit what the proper attire is for the show. So I appreciate that. We got a lot of talked about during, even though it's the off season. I know we like the off season is slow, but I don't know how you think of things, but sometimes the weekly grind of the season ends up just making it, it's a little repetitive, right? The stuff that you have to do during the season, and then you grind through it. And then I feel like the off season is almost a time where I can expand my mind a little bit more and think a little bit more about what's going on. So maybe before we get into anything else, you've been at the NFL for a few years now. And I assume during the season, again, you're probably doing a lot of that grinding out sort of work. How does the offseason lay out for you? And specifically, we'll talk about the big data bowl and those sorts of things a little bit later. But generally, how do you approach, and does your team and department approach an offseason where I'm assuming you have some time to delve into subjects and to research that you don't have during the season?
Yeah, generally our off season we set out March, April, pick the priorities that we want to focus on. And those have generally been long-term projects. I would almost equate it to sort of like a research type project in grad school or something like that, where it takes time to get and aggregate and clean all the data. It takes time to think about what methods are most appropriate to answer those questions. So we've done a couple of those in my, this is now my fourth year. I've done 4 full years. So, we've had a handful of different types of those. And this year, it's just sort of keeping up with the NFL and answering some of those long-term questions. And then, like you said, in season, it's very much what happened last week, what's going to happen next week, what are the questions we need to answer now, because the cycle doesn't stop once August comes.
No, it does not. And I'm kind of interested in the ideation process when you're talking about coming up with what you may research. Is this something that is it coming from above? They're saying you should check this out in a vague way, and then you're dealing in on it. Are you coming up with this, and then I don't know, getting approval necessary or not from above? Like, how does that end up working?
So it's some level of push pull. There are certainly projects that we have been said, hey, go look at this, and then there are other times where we'll say, hey, we feel like this is a project that we can tackle and handle. In my time, we've tackled all things from diversity, inclusion, sort of looking at coaches and how they go up and down the pipeline. We've built models for win probability in the off season. We're now doing a lot with our tracking data and penalties to try to better understand what we can learn from the tracking data that would help our officials. So it kind of runs the gamut. And some of those are, hey, what can we get out of this data? And other times it's like, hey, actually, this is a really interesting question that we know you've been asking about, and now we have the data to go answer.
No, I know. I mean, you have, I guess Tom Bliss works there too, right? I've seen his work out there. He does great stuff. He's doing some presentations there. I saw that maybe you were hiring for sports sciencey type of position coming in there. So how many people do you have working there? And is hiring growing? Is that a big part of what you're trying to do? Bring in some additional expertise to what you currently have?
So when I started, we were a team of 3, and 2 of our analysts that have been there from the start. One is Sean McKee, who's our director on the officiating side. And then under him is Jack Persampire, and Jack and Sean more or less run most of our officiating analytics, and they are doing replay metrics. They are as close to business experts. They know football better than anybody that I know. They're in there on the AMGC on Sundays. They report one-to-one with the officials sometimes based on things that they're seeing and trying to help our officials prepare for the game. And they're also good with data. And they've been there from the start. Tom was an intern in our group and was so good that I did everything I could for almost 2 years to get him in full time. Now he is. We just hired Allie Blake as an analyst on to work with Sean, Jack, and Tom, and she's interned at the NBA League office, and she's going to be doing a lot of fun stuff with our officiating data. And then we hired Andrew Patton as a director level player health and safety. That's an area that we're delving more into and is one of our off-season priorities now, where we've always looked at our rules from an officiating perspective. But I think long term, the league is best off sort of understanding, well, a lot of our rules are designed for player health and safety. So we should probably have that viewpoint too. And then we also have, a couple more analysts that we are developers or other folks that we're, in the market for too right now that should be coming on board soon. So our team is growing. I think in a lot of respects, we mimic how the teams have done it in the sense that, maybe 2018, 2019, the tracking data is here. Let's get somebody that can look at the tracking data and figure out what are fun, interesting projects to do with this. And, now that you have somebody or you have your growing team, it's like, oh shit, we have more questions we want out of this group. We need to hire more people. I hope it's okay that I swore.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll throw the explicit tag on there. I should have known when you're bringing in someone from the NFL.
Yeah,
The S and F bombs will just
oh,
start
shoot.
flying.
So it's a really exciting time for us in a lot of respects and it's always been this way, but a lot of the questions we're asking, nobody else has the data that we have and nobody else is asking them. And, with that comes a lot of responsibility. We have to do it right. We have to think about our end users. And ultimately, we have to think a lot about what are we trying to show here? What can we do that can improve this part of the game? Because it's actually probably easier just to do the analysis, that actual end goal of saying, okay, what do we want? What is the change that we're suggesting, or what is the change that we're hoping for? That's a trickier aspect because you're trying to change the behavior of folks using data, and that's not always as obvious.
Well, can we talk a little bit about the player safety stuff? I don't know how much you want to reveal, but I am kind of interested in the process of coming up with a goal and then working further and further towards it. I mean, you mentioned the officiating stuff, so that makes sense. You would have had that long established. There's a decent feedback loop that you can get where you can look at how the calls are being made, a change is being made, kind of grade officials, that sort of thing. For the player safety, it's a little bit, maybe in my opinion, a little bit squishier because you have more obvious things when a player is injured on a particular play and they're out based upon that. Concussion happens, something like that. Then you're going to have longer term things where I don't like how much can you build data and can you have a goal for, we don't want to grind these players down, whatever that means over time, like a long term kind of even after career quality of life is probably a pretty important thing, not just with the concussion stuff, but you see these guys at their Hall of Fame ceremonies. Sometimes they can barely walk. It seems like going up there. So I guess all those different things pop into my mind. And is that the sort of thing you just have a bunch of different ideas and you have to be able to narrow down and figure out how we can get good data to work with?
So I think it's a couple of things there. One is we're not the player health and safety experts. There are other folks that can help us with that and do a lot of that work. So the league works with two companies, one in the engineering side, BioCore, which does a lot of our equipment testing and some analytical research, and IQVIA on the epidemiology side. They drive a lot of the foundations of the league's analysis. But there are areas that we can help with, and we would consider ourselves, experts in as well, or able to do a lot of the analysis. So, for example, one question that we're targeting this offseason is the quarterback when they're potentially scrambling or design run plays. I think one question is what is the injury risk on those plays? Two, what are recommended behaviors for quarterbacks in those situations based on keeping them safe? And one example is the quarterback slide. Right now, we're sort of fundamentally assuming that quarterbacks should be sliding. I don't know if that's the case, right? They're making a choice to slide. We have multiple injuries you can probably look up that happen when a quarterback has slid. Is there a safer slide? Is there is there some impact of that slide? Similar with behavior out of bounds, that's one area of focus from the football side where the quarterback position is a current focus and has really been the last 2 decades. So better understanding the evolution of the game as it pertains to the quarterback, and then what the quarterback is actually doing. There are pretty substantial differences between quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts spends maybe 15% of his time outside the pocket with the ball. Roethlisberger and Brady are like 2%. So in terms of the amount of time that those players that are in the Hurts, Lamar, Josh Allen mold, the amount of exposure that they have towards other players hitting them is much different than the Bens and the Bradys. And we're transitioning towards a league that is going to have more Jalen's and more Lamar's. And so, what is the long term impact of that? I think is a really fundamental question for the league to think about, and that's one that we're trying to tackle.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting to me. I feel like I could talk to you probably for an hour about some of this stuff because, yeah, the slide is definitely something that I have noticed where not only is it leave you exposed in a kind of way for the quarterback, but I also think, and this is whatever, I'm just riffing a little bit here, but I also think it adds the potential for the head impact to the turf afterwards too, and that seems to probably cause more concussions than the actual hit itself in some of those circumstances. So yeah, I would be very interested in how that would work, and maybe just preliminarily when you're talking about these quarterbacks being outside the pocket, there was an idea, a data-based idea. I thought it was maybe a little bit of a selection bias type of problem where there was an idea kind of circulating, at least within the last few years, where there were fewer running quarterbacks, that these quarterbacks who did run a decent amount, maybe a Russell Wilson, other guys, they weren't missing any time. They weren't getting injured as much. So the idea became maybe the pocket is the least safe place for a quarterback in some ways because these guys who are running more often were not getting injured. But I don't know. I felt like maybe those guys just knew how to take care of themselves. What's your opinion on the additional risk taken on by a quarterback getting outside of the pocket? Because in some ways, they can at least see and feel and react to the hit coming as opposed to being in the pocket. And I think that's always been a push-pull where I've never quite figured out on what side I stand. Is a rushing quarterback more risky or more injury prone than someone who is in the pocket?
So there's a lot to think about there. And I'll start. There's a really good, I think Adam Harstad wrote a really interesting article about, I think it's called the German playground problem, where, and I might be butchering it. It's been a couple months since I've read it. But it has to do with quarterbacks being responsible for their own risk.
Right.
And the idea being that when you make playgrounds safer, you still have the same number of injuries on the playground because kids will just now take more risks. That is one question that we are thinking about with the NFL. In other words, we made a lot of changes to the game to keep the quarterback safe in the pocket. And now potentially, and this is unfounded, but just a theory that we're trying to think about, quarterbacks now maybe take more risks, right? Now we can hang on to the ball a little bit longer. Now we can leave the pocket a little bit faster. And what's really tricky to untangle is you have the sort of quarterback effect, but you also have, is the pocket the safest place? I don't know. If you're going to throw passes in 2 seconds out of shotgun, pocket's probably the safest place. If you're going to have long drawn out pass plays, I'm not sure how safe that pocket is by the end of the pass play. So it's hard to untangle that from scheme and play design. And then the last thing that is also interesting, and we hear coaches talk about in the offseason, is it's also related to how we're calling penalties on the defense. In other words, if illegal contact is down, which it was this past year, and players are able to get away with more, the quarterbacks have to hang on to the ball longer, and then now they're exposed to injury. So it's kind of a system of influences that is certainly hard to untangle. And, in our perspective, it's probably a little bit of everything, right? It's a little bit of how we're officiating it. It's a little bit of the evolution of the game. It's a little bit of the fact that college schemes have changed, and so we're going to get the more mobile quarterbacks anyways. Even once we get past that, I think from our perspective, there are quarterbacks that take more and fewer risks. And, it's a good fundamental question is how from our perspective, does that matter? How do we impact it if we are going to do something about it? And then, from our perspective, when it's 3rd and 12 and you're scrambling and you're going to take a hit out of bounds, we just assume the quarterback run 11 yards behind the first down marker as 10, but not all quarterbacks think that way. They want to prove a point. They want to dive into somebody. And ultimately that is a risk, right? So trying to define those risks is something that we are starting to think about. And Andrew, who I mentioned earlier, is outstanding in thinking from that perspective. What does our data tell us? What other things do we need to get? It is a long-term project, but that, like we started with, that's part of the offseason.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, so many questions. So it seems incredibly fascinating because I mean, I've always been the opinion. I know like sacks or quarterback stats sort of thing is what people will talk about to oversimplify these sort of equations. But I mean, I think there's always been quarterbacks who they're doing kind of like mental cost benefit analysis in their head of I hold it a little bit longer, what sort of extra yardage, what sort of extra play potential do I have, and then the cost side of that is taking a hit. And some guys, I mean, Andrew Luck is probably a famously a guy that people pointed to, his offensive line was so bad and other things like that. But I think he was willing to take hits. Like he was willing early in his career to take a lot of hits. Maybe Joe Burrow is that type of player now. Whereas Ben Roethlisberger, God bless him, he took a lot of hits early in his career. I think the last couple of years he wasn't trying to take any hits, and I don't blame him as an older quarterback. So yeah, like teasing out that element of it because that's going to skew all the data that you're collecting on whether someone stays in the pocket or not, whether someone scrambles or not. They have a different calculus in their head onto whether they're willing to take those hits or not, and that can kind of change everything there. So extremely complicated. I'm sure keeping you very, very, very busy on that front, and I'll be interested to hear what the rule changes are going forward on that type of stuff. Let's talk Big Data Bowl for a second, since that is kind of the I don't know the flag. You can really plant your flag there and the impact that you've had over the league. And I know you don't want to take too much credit on this versus the participants and everyone else involved in the Big Data Bowl, but as of now, give me some of the highlights as far as how many people we've had participate in this annual data event that you've set up, you've made public, you open it up to everyone, so it's not just a few Ivy League grads who are getting interviews with teams, but it's open up to everyone. They compete, they show their work, and now this has become maybe the main pipeline of data analytics hires in the NFL.
Yeah, I'm looking at our spreadsheet now. We're up to 8 from this past year's event that have been hired by teams or affiliate vendors of the league. It's exciting. I think our we've kind of built a brand, and I think that was initially not part of the process. The goal initially was let's establish the NFL as a forward thinking organization using data, and as part of that, we are going to get folks hired. But we're now going from we're not just analytics competition, but we're also now representing the league, right? In the sense that there are people that are outside of data that are paying attention. So with that comes extra pressure, comes extra responsibility. We have the sponsorship with AWS, who has been great, from the budget side of things, but then also, in terms of, they give us judges and they help us run the contest. So we're certainly lucky. This is, bigger than I think any of us initially set out to be. But it does, this is something that is important to us. It gives every person that enters an even opportunity to succeed. And in that sense, if you are skilled with data and or know football, or at the intersection of those, or you can work with somebody who can fill in the gaps that you aren't great at, you can enter our contest. There's no, and the other thing is we give you a couple months, right? You can do it on your own time when you're free. And the fact that, the winning group gets $15,000, right? There is actual, there is a benefit here on top of the potential job. And teams, I would say there are maybe a third to half of the teams in the last 2 months have emailed saying, send me your Big Datable resumes, right? Like, who did you have win this year? So I almost can't keep up with it. In the sense that, like there are only so many folks that both entered and want a job in the NFL, because we do have folks that enter and don't want a job in the NFL, or we have folks that enter and do well, but have another year or two of school. So, I think the supply and demand are both pretty fair right now, and I'm happy to keep doing it. Our issue from now is like we've covered a lot of the different areas of football using tracking data, and at some point we either have to repeat an area or try a really difficult one, and either of those are going to be a little bit trickier to do. So we'll see what comes next year.
Has anything surprised you about the profile of people who have been successful in the big data bowl, and then have maybe not necessarily gone on to being higher, but just people have been successful as far as that push pull between, or maybe it doesn't have to be a push pull, it doesn't have to be a compromise, but between programming, problem solving, football knowledge, experience, maybe older, younger, things like that. Has anything surprised you from how the results have come out, or is it all over the place?
I mean, each year there's a handful of entries where I read and I say, "Oh shit!" Like that's I swore again. Uh,
I need to get a jar here.
I anyways, there's just sometimes where I read something and I'm like, "That's really clever." I don't
Yeah,
know if a team's going to need it. I don't know if who like where this fits in. But the fact that this person or this group came up with it for free, this year there was like a virtual reality punt returner one.
yeah.
And so it's like imagine yourself as the punt returner facing, and it's like, holy cow, like, it's not ready for prime time now. But those are the ideas that 5, 10, 15 years from now, yeah, maybe you are ready, right? And so I think the cleverness of the participants never ceases to amaze us. And additionally, the the sort of general support from the public, I think, has been really fun too. The reality of a couple of years ago when we were in person in Indianapolis, we had basically a who's who of a lot of the different NFL analytics experts there, and it was just sort of fun to get that representation. And like I said earlier, we have decision makers that are now paying attention, and depending on the theme, like a couple of years ago was running backs. Well, we had running backs coaches in the room. This year's was special teams. We had special teams coaches that will now pay attention. And so, bridging that gap is, I think, really, really helpful. And related, I think one thing we did this year, which we certainly hope to do in future years, is when you're on a team, there's never a time where you're going to be like, oh, I'm going to go analyze the tracking data and that's it. A lot of them are blending the tracking data with the PFF data, and starting with PFF and then adding in tracking data or vice versa. And being able to do that this year, I think really gave participants a good sense of like, hey, I have the same exact data that the NFL teams do. They might have a little bit more, but by and large, I can answer questions that should be catered directly to what they're trying to, improve with their team. And that for us was a big help this year.
Yeah, no, one of the things I've thought about with hiring when it comes to the NFL that was maybe a little bit behind some of the other sports is if a team is just starting to build, let's say, this sort of research and development, analytics, whatever you want to call it, capacity, you might not necessarily have the expertise to even be able to judge the expertise of the people that you're hiring. So then, that's when you get into like, whoever has the highest GPA at Harvard and then hire them sort of situation. Now this is building on this a bit more. Do you think you mentioned coaches and others coming, which I think is fantastic to really get a view into that. At the same time, is there maybe still a little bit of a gap there where being able to judge who's good or not now has just become as a proxy? They could just say whoever did well in the big data bowl, I'm going to hire them, even though I don't really know whether their expertise is going to fit in with what I want them to do.
Yeah, I think that's definitely relevant. I mean, the if you remember, one of the initial voices in pro football analytics was Trey Kazi, and he had a really good article probably about a decade ago about this time about the cold start problem, which is that these organizations are not, they don't have a group of 8 to 10 data science leaders that can say, hey, we're going to interview all these people and we're competent to pick the next one, right? You might have one or two people, and additionally, you probably don't have a lot of time. Teams hire right after the draft, right before they're going on break, and it's just not conducive with sort of a long, a fruitful interview process. I do think that's the case. I think one thing that's definitely shifting a little bit in the league is we've always had a variety of titles, but we are starting to see titles that are maybe more reflective of growing data organizations. And so, in other words, you might have had a star data scientist or analyst person before, but you probably had to call them like, I don't know, a coordinator or a manager, or you would, if they were been around, you would call them a director. But that's not necessarily how a lot of data organizations are. They'll have really well experienced data scientists that aren't trying to become a general manager, or they're not trying to become a assistant GM or vice president or executive. Their job is to do a really good job of analyzing data. or on the engineering side, do a really good job of building some apps or something else to help their team. And teams are starting to hire more in that space where we just need the most talented person, and we probably have to pay a little bit more than we might be used to paying for somebody that's 27 or 30 or something like that. But they have the skills that we need, and we're going to create this new role for them. So I do think, as I look at Seth Wilder's list of who's been hired, and we keep a similar one internally, we have a growing number of fields that are like, that person is there to crush the tracking data, or they're there to do a really good job at building models. And ultimately, like that's how they're going to be judged. And it's nice that the club has the perspective to say, hey, this is the type of person that we need. I can be the conduit to get the messaging across. We can, I look at like what the Zoo did a couple of years ago with expected rush yards. Those guys would crush it on a team if they were given the right questions to ask and the right frameworks for analyzing questions. But you can't just hire them and say, hey, go win us games, because they're not football experts. So I think teams are starting to be a little bit more progressive and forward thinking in building their data organizations. But we're it's not too long ago that there were a third of the teams in the league didn't have anybody. So it's still something that the teams are slowly building.
Yeah, because I mean, the big data bowl now, it is. I mean, you're basically like a different variation of a tracking data type of question has been a lot of the focus. So I guess I would wonder whether some of these teams, I guess there could be a little bit of a disconnect in that the teams aren't ready for someone to really be able to focus and look through the tracking data, and maybe the people who are being hired, I mean, presumably they're talking about what their role is going to be and they have some idea of it, but they might be at a certain level of programming and working with the tracking data, and then they come in and it's like, hey, can you like crunch these reports for us or do something of that nature? I don't know if that's happening or not, but I guess, have you even thought from a big data bowl perspective, maybe one year we step back from the tracking data sort of stuff and we try to do something where it opens it up even further to people who don't have that sort of expertise, but maybe could fill a role in the NFL, but aren't sophisticated enough to be able to do tracking data type of work and fill that niche, which may still be there and probably for most teams is still something they need to fill, and they're not necessarily ready for that tracking data guy at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we're always open to ideas, and that's a pretty relevant point too. Like, there always has to be some level of there has to be a conduit between, even if you are able to create these metrics, what do you do with them? Like, how are you going to present them and things like that? And then also, you're totally right. Every team has an analyst that builds a dashboard each week for some coach, and what's on that dashboard? What message are you trying to get across? Those are different skills too, and I'm not sure we're doing a great job of capturing them now in our current event. But it doesn't mean that it can't be a priority in the future, particularly given that week to week, that's what a lot of the folks are doing. But there are, like I said earlier, there are folks that are maybe more long term thinkers, and their job is use this tracking data and don't come up with an answer for September. We just need a really good model for next year when we're going to be looking at a quarterback or wide receivers or something like that.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I
probably
mean,
valuable.
here's my idea. You can take it or leave it. Is like, I don't think you want to not have the tracking data stuff because it's fascinating. It's the next wave, is everything else. But maybe it could be like two categories. I'm just trying to give you more work, basically, of of like a tracking data, maybe like a non-tracking data category of something to do. I think that could always be interesting. And again, open it up to some people who maybe don't have that sort of expertise. So
Awesome.
Okay, so one other thing when it comes to hiring here, because this is something that I've thought about a lot. I think for the hiring that's been going on in the front offices for these types of positions, I think we've seen a number of areas where you could say that the R&D and the analytical hires are bringing more diversity than we've typically seen to the NFL when it comes to like women who are filling some of these roles, non, like whatever you want to say, POC, if you want to use that terminology. But then the hires, I still think eventually, and what becomes a potential issue is you're probably just going to see a lot of the same issues that you're going to see with big tech companies and others where, yes, you're getting a diversity which is not like an NFL type of diversity, but you're still not getting diversity, you're getting the same diversity problems that a tech company, let's say, would have, where a tech company looks very different from the NFL. So it's different, but it still limits maybe some participation from groups and from others outside of the typical tech hire. Do you think, how do you think about those sort of stuff and how maybe that pipeline can be enhanced?
So each of the last 2 years, we've had the mentoring program, which is our our initial foray into answering that question. Like we looked at the distribution of names. I think it was our 2020 contest of the participants that entered, and certainly we can't tell from names alone. But it was not a particularly diverse group of entrants, and for us that just wasn't good enough. So we pair somewhere between 10 and 20 junior analysts that we reach out to all the HBCUs, we reach out to the all women's colleges. We're basically trying to find folks that are not commonly found in tech and in football analytics. And our job is to say, hey, listen, if you have an interest in football and data science / statistics, you're our target, right? If you can code a little bit, you're who we want in football analytics. And we pair them with folks that are on teams and they work on a big data role submission. I think the first year, each of the 2 years we've done it, we probably had of the 15 or 16 folks we paired, somewhere between 8 and 10 of the mentees turned that into a submission. In terms of, our first year, Jill Reiner, I believe has a job with an NHL team now. I don't know if she's announced it, but she did tell me she did. And she also
Okay, breaking news here on the pod.
And then Ella Summer was with the Dolphins. I think also with the Twins previously. This past year, Alex Pasantes is an intern in our league office now. So our job is to find those folks that want an extra step in building a submission. We pair them with people on teams, and ultimately what happens from there is a little bit up to them and how hard they work at it. But that's our answer, is to sort of say, like, let's go find these folks. Let's tell them that this is an option, and encourage them to enter football analytics.
You know what? This okay. There's another unsolicited free idea that I have here, which probably won't work. But it's I also think, like, there's been this thing on, because everything's a mess on social media, right? But there's like a little bit people at loggerheads between, I would say, like the coaching element of someone where, let's face it, it's a grind, right? To grind your way up from whether it be high school or college, it's who it's working these ridiculous hours, it's doing other things. I just feel like there's probably untapped potential within, a younger, more technologically inclined subset who are trying to grind their way up this coaching ladder in a traditional manner, where if they had an interest and a degree of discipline, that they could say, maybe I want to add these sorts of skills to what I'm doing, differentiate myself, and get a better pathway into the NFL, and that sort of person. But I'm not quite sure how you bridge that gap. Have you ever thought about something like that, like a type of program where you could help, like I said, these younger coaches and others build up a skill set that's going to really potentially propel them into a position where they wouldn't have to grind up in the same way that you would do traditionally for coaching?
Yeah, I think in some sense, I still think the grind would be there, but
Yes.
it would be able to say, like, hey, maybe it makes the grind a little faster. So there are a couple of league programs. There's 2 fellowships, Bill Walsh and Nunn Wooten, that Football Operations runs. We work with Vanessa from Football Ops to try and find folks in those that are interested in those fellowships, that have some interest in data, whether they took a couple classes or they follow sort of up to date expected points or things like that, right? Those are folks that we try to encourage them to participate, because listen, when you're in those roles and you can be someone that also speaks to the data folks, that's going to give you a leg up that a lot of folks aren't going to do. The league also runs the Women in Football Forum, I think it's called, and same type of deal. Each year, the last couple of years, there have been a few women that have the data side to things too. And for us, that's really exciting, just because we do feel like those folks are going to be able to have relationships with the analytics staffers that not everyone would. So in that sense, we're trying to find those. I don't want to call them unicorns, right? But they're the future, And there are a couple teams that have those folks. Ty Hamlin with the Cleveland Browns was just promoted to director of football operations. He is someone in that mold, and that for us is a great, sort of representation of, I think, where football will be in 5-10 years, where you're going to have coaches that came up, they were doing projects in NFL analytics when they were in college, whereas when we came up, there wasn't really much in football analytics to do a project with. So, I mean, I did baseball as a thesis. So, like, there are going to be future coaches that are going to be well versed in, hey, this is why teams are going for it on fourth down. This is why the play action pass is generally valuable. These are the tendencies that we should be bringing to our organization. They're infiltrating, but they're probably just sort of on the lower steps now. And as they grow, I think you're right. There will be more of a demand and eventually an expectation to be able to talk, on the data side of things too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not the most well versed on the backgrounds of a lot of coaches, but I remember even reading some things about someone like Robert Saleh when he was coming up. That one way he was able to differentiate himself is, he's not like a programmer of any sort, but he was able to, kind of show to do things a little bit more quickly because he had some aptitude in working with these sorts of things. I mean, I'm thinking of guys that I've talked to personally, like Daniel Stern with the Ravens, or Ryan Paganetti, who's now with the Jaguars, where the having that background has definitely helped them move in to and get into a spot where, I mean, let's face it, coaching is just, it's very much a relationship, luck slash healthy degree of nepotism type of business to make it all the way up there. So I would think it would be interesting for those guys where they don't have to become, data experts, but they could have a little bit of a lean in that sort of area. You mentioned like hiring stuff that you've looked at. So have you looked at the larger coaching hiring practices or front office hiring practices outside of the nerds and what's going on in the R&D departments?
Yeah, so we've built even some naive to some fairly methodological complex looks at the coaching pipeline in the NFL, trying to understand what are the transitions like, and how that has evolved over time. From it started as sort of these are fundamental questions to what the league is asking. I think back to a couple of years ago, there was a good question about what the timeline should be like for head coaching interviews. And so one of our questions was, how do coaches that make the title games, conference title games, how do they compare to the coaches that lose the round before? And, there was the assumption like, hey, these guys have a harder time getting hired. Well, we can check that, right? And sure enough, conditional on how good they were in the regular season, they do actually have a harder time getting hired, which seems kind of crazy because they won the previous game. So that's the type of stuff we have been doing, is sort of answering a lot of the questions that I think the league has been asking, and rightfully so, but putting some valid numbers to it.
I mean, can you analyze something like, I don't know, I guess the benefit or cost of the Rooney Rule is probably a big thing that people talk about a lot. I mean, is that something you can analyze? Because I mean, that someone's been interviewed. You don't know if it's necessarily 100% due to the Rooney Rule, unless they're the only person being interviewed for a job that qualifies in that regard. And then I guess you could look at their trajectory going forward, but you're not going to have necessarily the largest data set to work with in that regard.
Well, so I think we'd be more thinking, what is the promotion rates for tight ends to offensive coordinators, and how does that relate to how good they were as a tight ends coach? That's a really hard question to answer, but at least you can look at, yards per game or something like that, passing yards, whatever. So that would be, sort of what have the transitions been like? How has that differed by experience, race, ethnicity? Did they play in the league? Did they not play in the league? Separate that by positional coach, looking at going up to offense, going up to head coach. And then, you can do the same thing with, time and position, particularly at the head coach or offensive defensive coordinator positions. How long did they last? How was that related to success? Was that linked to, how good the team was when they started? There's actually some fairly, I would say, complex models. You can do survival analysis. On the coach hiring side, we use conditional logistic regression to look at how many hires there were for a certain number of spots. So really interesting data, but certainly stuff that is a little bit sensitive, but then also, to be honest, kind of a nightmare to clean too. So we're doing that, and now this summer we're doing it on the GM side too, looking at transitions to general managers. So we're sort of building out the framework to provide that each season and each off season. And then obviously with some of the recent rules changes, we could be able to use this in a couple of years to look back and say, here's where there were improvements, or here's things that haven't changed.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of noise, obviously, in these things, in these cycles, but at least on the front office side, on the GM side, there's been a lot more hiring of not only more black GMs, but a lot of there seems to be almost a turnover as far as a lot of younger guys getting into that mold who kind of fit, also being a little bit more sophisticated on the analytical side. Do you think that's a real trend, or do you think that's kind of noise there? And I guess, like me, are you optimistic about the fact that there seems to be some turnover in that sort of area, as opposed to maybe your traditional, you bring in Ernie Accorsi or someone like that. Maybe I shouldn't name anyone in particular, but they just pick your next GM based upon a list of guys who have been either retreads or on that type of scale.
Well, our biggest problem now is that not a league problem, but our data problem. It's like the Office episode. It's like we have assistant general manager, assistant to the general manager, general
Right.
manager, executive assistant. Like, well, I mean, come on. So before we get to really sort of have there been changes? I certainly anecdotally it does seem that way, and I believe Kwesi is the first GM that can code and has a coding background of some variety. So that's exciting. And if you look, certainly football has followed the trend a little bit of baseball and basketball and some of these hires. And that would seem to be where we're going. I would be pretty surprised if we don't get there. But it's not a linear direction there. You go up, you go down a little bit, you go up a little bit. So that's kind of where I see front offices trending. But with probably a little bit too early to speculate on is that big picture change a reality?
Yeah. I mean, there's, as you mentioned, there's like more and more kind of people in R&D also being hired, but there's so many priorities that especially new GMs have to take care of and get up to speed on, that it probably makes it difficult to move too much in that area. Okay, so as long as we're talking all things hiring and networking and everything else, I want to talk with you a little bit about the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. For those who don't know, it is an annual, I guess, late February, early March-ish sort of tradition in the Boston area. It's sponsored by MIT. It is run by Daryl Morey and I should have the other name,
Jessica
Jessica,
Gelman.
what?
Gelman.
Jessica Gelman there. And there was an article that came out in the Washington Post not too long ago where you and some others were quoted in there. And I think, it was basically bringing to life, or maybe putting the spotlight a little bit more on what some concerns have been about the conference for a while, as far as the cost, maybe the direction of where they've gone, of having a lot more of celebrity sort of marketing to the conference, as opposed to being a real kind of nuts and bolts analytics type of conference. But it's also something that I think people find a ton of value in, as far as networking everyone in one place in one location. So you had some critiques there. Do you want to kind of talk about what was concerning you about what you'd seen there, and maybe where this fits in the larger picture of how people should think about networking and the value of these types of events?
So I've been looking at in Sloan and thinking about the conference and participating for almost a decade at this point. So I want to say 2012ish, maybe I submitted a paper, and I remember being selected as a poster participant. Might have been 2013, almost a decade ago. And at that point, the tickets for the conference were sold out. So I was a poster winner, and I said, "All right, I want to be there to present my poster." And they said, "Well, tickets are sold out." So I'm like, "So you want my poster there, but I can't be there to present it?" I'm like, it wasn't even a free ticket. So that gave me a sense back then a little bit about what it is. It's run by a business school. It's run by students at the business school who are extremely hardworking. They do not get enough credit for basically doing this free labor, right? But that's been the model for years, and certainly, I think that growth in ticket prices is one thing, but the general, the general. I'll be honest, it's cheap, right? Like I busted my ass on a research paper that eventually got published in Journal of Sports Economics. It was, one of the things I basically did at night while the rest of my family was sleeping, and it was something I felt proud of, and it's something I'm still passionate about today, which is the NHL's point system. And uh, to not even be invited to participate and not be given a free ticket, I'm like, come on, like what are we doing here? And at that point, that was just an individual concern. I think at this point, now that I'm a little bit more further along in my professional career, back then I'm a grad student, right? Who's going to listen to me? I mean, ultimately, they did give us a ticket that year because I complained about it. But at that point, like there's not many changes you're going to make when you're a unknown grad student. Um, Certainly I'm a little bit more comfortable now, but I think more big picture, the conference is certainly the preeminent stage, or at least boast to be the preeminent stage for sports analytics research. And, it is certainly a who's who of folks that attend. And in that position, I believe the conference has a responsibility to represent the best of the field. And, that's between the exclusivity that we mentioned, the general cheapness, the grad school labor, and not letting co-writers present. I know last year there was a Big Data Bowl group that was an online conference, and they wouldn't even give online tickets to the co-writers. Certainly, the some of the other things that came out in that article that were a little bit surprising and disappointing. I just don't think that's the direction the field of sports analytics should be heading. I look at what we're doing at the Big Data Bowl, which is open to anyone, free to enter, and we purposely go out and make connections for some of the participants. And the value is ideally entirely in the research ideas. And the networking comes afterwards if you have those initial research ideas to start with. So, that's where I stand on it, and it's certainly something that I'm a little bit passionate about. But I do understand the conference has done a lot for a lot of people, but I just think that the future of sports analytics should probably look a little bit different than the last 15 years have, and it's on the folks that are in the organizations now to spearhead that change.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just some details around it. So the tickets are $425 for students, $850 for everyone else. At least there's different levels that go into it. And what I thought was interesting about it. I mean, I am not a veteran like you are of maybe having been there for a long time, but even in the short handful of years that I've been attending, it seems like there's a core of the type of work that you're talking about, the core analytical work, and a core subset of people who are really focused on that. And then what's grown outside of it is a larger complex for selling, marketing, selling other things, bringing in celebrity types or well-known people, and all that, costs a lot of money. And it's being sponsored, I would say, in most part by like corporate expense of corporations paying for people, and they don't care whether it's $850 if someone's going there, probably, or whether it's $200 if someone's going there. They're just paying it, and that's what's kind of raising the prices for everyone, which is maybe a phenomenon for everything, right? Whether it's like if you're going to a baseball game or something, the corporate tickets playing things up there too. But I guess from their perspective, they are growing the conference. It is successful. It is sold out on a year by year basis. So maybe it's just trying to accomplish something different than what you're hoping it would accomplish. Is there just a disconnect there, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it probably comes down to how you're defining success. My
Yeah.
opinion is that if you're a sports analytics conference, success is based on the novelty, the creativity of the sports analytics ideas that come from the conference. And in that sense, for example, you can look for a long time, the vast majority of research papers use proprietary data and did not share code. Uh, Again, I'll contrast that to the Big Data Bowl, where you quite literally have to share all your code and you're using the public data. And again, if I want to think about where the field of sports analytics is heading in the future, those proprietary black box algorithms, they don't even make it in academia, right? Much less help you win games on a team. So, from our perspective, right, maybe they're solving for different things. They're trying to accomplish different things. But if that's the case, it's a sports business conference, right? Or something like that. I look at the field of sports analytics as part of Sloan, but I think the flagship conference, does have that extra responsibility, to lead the field forward. And in some senses, yeah, great. There's money to be made, but from from my perspective, there are other things that you could be try to be doing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to be uh, too kind of mean about some of these stories, but I do think it's kind of grown into, it's a big event for which which definitely caters to the higher end of, whoever it may be, the celebrity of whoever it's been there, and it's probably been maximized to do that sort of thing. So let's not talk about Sloan then. Let's talk about other sports analytics conferences that people may not know about. What are other ones you want to point to and say this is what I think is being done right, that people should be aware of, if at the time they're only aware of big things like Sloan at this point?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of sort of mom and pop type conferences that I think are really well done, and I say that because they are quite literally run by like two or three people, and they're not taking money for it, and the research there is generally top notch. Will result in academic publications. Will also result in a lot of the networking you would see at Sloan. The ones that stand out are the New England Symposium on Statistics in Sports. That's every other year in New England, run by Mark Glickman and Scott Evans. The Carnegie Mellon one is, I think, at this point annual, and it's run each fall at Carnegie Mellon. They have involved a lot of Big Data Bowl over the years there, and Ron and Sam and Rebecca have done a really incredible job of building a brand there too. They also run a summer workshop for students, which is great. Cassis, which is the Cascadia, it's the sort of Vancouver version of Nessus. It's run in opposite years. That's one. There's been one in Denver. There's a whole cadre of hockey ones that are held at different times. Rochester is one. There's I think a couple other hockey ones that have been held over the years. So that's those are the places. There's one in the Midwest. I think Midwest Sports Analytics Symposium. There's been one in North Carolina. In general, all of those will be substantially cheaper to attend. Conference tickets for students are somewhere in the neighborhood of $50, and a lot of them have scholarships that you can get that comped. It's just a matter of finding them, and certainly they're a little bit less well known. But generally, those would be the ones where I would see a lot of newer novel research, and to be honest, probably have a much higher success rate in terms of hiring folks, just because it's easier to make connections when there's only 200 people there as opposed to a couple thousand.
Yeah, how has representation been when from teams and from others at some of these smaller conferences?
I mean, I certainly think at Sloan you might have a lot of figureheads representing different fields, but I would say, I don't know, my guess is maybe only 8 NFL teams were at this past one. I mean, so
Yeah,
it's not
it's
like
not good
NFL
timing
teams
for
are,
the NFL.
no,
I mean, it's kind of, designed by Daryl, so it kind of makes sense that it's decent timing for the NBA.
right. So I think there are probably leagues and teams that are better, that Sloan might be better at. But the NFL does not. There isn't sort of one that I would say, hey, go here and you'll meet 8 to 10 teams. But you'll definitely meet some NFL analysts and some from other local teams at really holistically all of these. It just depends on the timing and the year. For our purpose, the one conference or event where everybody is at would be the Big Data Bowl. Once we can get back to in person, so that is one opportunity. But who knows what that's going to look like in the future in terms of timing and in person.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess there'll still be we still got the combine in Indianapolis for another year or two at least
We do.
before the screaming and hollering dies down and they ship everything out to Los Angeles or someplace else. Okay, so we talked about some of the stuff that you are working on. I know I may have posed this question to you in the past, and apologies I didn't have it on your sheet here. But is there anything that you like would love to do some research on that you just haven't had either the capacity, the time, or the know-how? Is there a particular area within the NFL that you feel like you could have a big effect on, but haven't had a chance to really dig into it at this point?
Uh, I think our influence has grown a little bit in the last couple of years. So I probably would have had a different answer a couple of years ago. And then in the last couple of years, we've started to do things that we maybe were outside of our natural area. So a couple of examples I can give. We on the football side have had metrics of how good our games were, and also done that both retrospectively and prospectively. So interestingly enough, that is stuff that our broadcast team has been interested in, and we are, one change that I didn't mention really at all this hour was all the leagues, different data groups at the New York headquarters are now under one umbrella. So we are part of the larger data and analytics team. So I used to report to football operations. We now report to data and analytics as a whole. And one of the things that's now easier is making these connections across the different data groups. So Tom has in particular, and our team has worked with the media side really on two things. One, scheduling. So take what the possible schedules are for the upcoming season, use projected win records, metrics for how good each quarterback is, and try to project what are the ratings going to look like for future seasons. And then also in season, last year we started for the first time, tinkering with, hey, how good do we think these games are going to be? And then more importantly, what are the chances that the games matter for the teams that are in those games? Which when you get to late in the season, there's definitely some simulation-based approaches you can do that are pretty clever to sort of say like, hey, there's a 80% chance that this game matters for both teams. There's a 20% chance that this game does not matter for one of these teams. They'll be resting starters because they're already locked into a playoff seed, or they're going to be eliminated. And then, maybe we don't want that team in prime time. So that's one example of something that's like, we have these metrics that are pretty solid for how good competitive our games are, how much our teams care about them in terms of are they eligible for the postseason or not. And being able to influence maybe revenue generating sides of the shop is a new area that, for us, is that, that's not something we were doing 3 or 4 years ago. So that's one, sort of newer area that I think will continue to evolve. And then the other one is that I think we'll continue to do more on the health and safety side with, some of the, ultimately a lot of our rules are really a blend of, it's sort of a combination of, what is the football outcome of this? What is the equipment side of this, or the engineering side of injuries that we have? And then also from the, epi side, what is that perspective? A lot of the, combination of rules changes. We did a whole dive this past season on special teams, and we had 8 or 9 special teams rules proposals that we looked at from a bunch of different angles, and came back to the league and said here's where each of those stands, and ultimately, that was part of the reason that there weren't any changes, is because there wasn't anything that, as you think about trying to maximize different things in the league, we could come up with a punt play that is safer, but we would have much fewer returns. We could come up with a punt play that had the same number of returns or more returns, but now has more injuries. It's like a lot of different things. It's like we have to balance officiating, health and safety, competitiveness, and excitement. And, a lot of our job is to try and find areas of the game to do that. So, that I think I don't necessarily know if there's one that is an untapped area, because I do think in the last couple of years, really the last 6 to 8 months, we've seen some changes on those fronts.
Well, I mean, I guess to follow up a little bit on both of those, because it kind of just jarred something in my mind of how, like, the health of the game generally, and you can not health meaning literal health of the players necessarily, but I think that is part of it. Seems to be in a really good place right now. I mean, I guess the dollars and cents way of thinking about it is maybe in around 2017, there was a little bit of issue with some of the ratings and other things. The NFL survived the pandemic probably as well or better than every other major sport out there. And now we have the new TV contracts that came through, Amazon and others bidding in there. And, those prices are are through the roof essentially there. So do the metrics that you're tracking, these things like competitiveness, things like that, is that really filtering through to tell you that there is something inherent in that way that's become healthier about the game? Or I always wonder sometimes, is it just a situation where in 2017, Aaron Rodgers was injured. There's kind of a lull in some quarterback play. And then since 2017, we've had, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Justin Herbert, Joe Burrow, all these guys just enter the league and really, spark some life back into it. And it's kind of something that's difficult to even get your head around whether that is something that's really infused excitement back into the league.
Yeah, I would certainly say a couple things. One is more fourth downs generally lead to more exciting games.
Yes.
Probably higher variance outcomes. So like it's weird, but I'm pretty sure we had more lead changes, but also more blowouts last year. So, depending on which metric you're looking at, you could get, like, our margin of victory was kind of similar. But you get more comebacks, but you're also more likely to lose maybe by 30. You're definitely right on the health of the quarterbacks as being a sort of fundamental to the business model. I want to say it's of Dallas's 65 primetime games in the last, I don't know, decade or so, the 5 lowest rated ones, I think, were Prescott's injury. So like that's an injury that impacts the league, in more ways than one. So and that's a rough anecdote. That's not exact. We had the exact one this past offseason, but I forget it. So most of our metrics would indicate that the last 2 seasons have been the healthiest the league has been in the last decade or so. And that's a combination of competitiveness, officiating, health and safety. Pace of play is a good one, especially this past year. I don't think we were any more competitive than in the COVID season. It certainly was more exciting because fans were there. But the fact that we had, we saved a couple hundred replays based on the, replay assistant process, that led to a more efficient game. And that's something that we would look at. So, from a lot of respects, the league, is in a really good spot. And, it's sort of up to the folks at the league office to keep that path going.
Great. Well, yeah, we'll hope we'll keep going. And I'm not just trying to, blow some smoke here or butter up my guest, but I will say, I'm going to say that, bringing you in from the NFL has been, probably one of the more impactful things that they've done. I know you don't have to comment on your own impact there, but I'm very happy about the direction that I've seen going in the league, not only the big data bowl stuff, but I know the stuff behind the scenes there where it's not going to happen overnight, of course, but being able to continue pushing it in that direction and improving the game. I think we're seeing it on the field and we'll see it going forward. So I appreciate your time again. Again, everyone, Mike Lopez, you can follow him on Twitter at StatsByLopez. Anything else you want to plug going forward? I know, of course, we're going to have the big data bowl and other stuff next year. Anything else you want to plug before I let you out of here?
No, thanks for the kind comments. I do think it's, for a lot of the different football organizations, it's sort of been a team effort. And, I think 4 or 5 years ago, it was sort of difficult to envision the NFL as being, getting to the stage that we're evolved and that we have events like the Big Data Bowl or, sort of data that is as proficient as some of the PFF stuff is. So it's exciting. And there's, we're certainly, on the upward trend. And so it's a fun time to be in football data. And I would encourage folks that are out there, that have their own questions, the data does exist and there's a lot more untapped areas. I think 5-10 years from now, we'll look back and say, I can't believe we didn't know this right now. But we're getting there. And, I would encourage folks to take statistics, data science courses and, improve their toolkit and come help teams answer some interesting questions.
Yeah, and take advantage of the data that's out there that's being provided by you and others. Yeah, in this one case, I will say correlation equals causation. Mike Lopez in the NFL, and boom, we've seen it. We've seen it in the chart there. Anyway, Mike, thank you so much for joining me again. I'm sure I'll bug you sometime in the future to have you come back on again. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And then I'll be back at you next week with a normal solo podcast and then another guest. Thanks so much, everyone.